optioned David Grand's book, which was fascinating and a lost part of American history. And we were horrified at this story, but it made for an incredibly gripping drama. And David Grand did such meticulous research into the history of the Osage, the reign of terror, the formation of the FBI, and the book was primarily based on the Tom White character and the birth of the FBI, because jurisdiction at that time was Native American territory. So it was really the onset of forensics and investigation. We went through, I believe, a couple-year process with Eric Roth of creating that screenplay, but then we had these readings, and the initial reading that we had, we kind of didn't feel much emotionally. I don't know how else to put it, but there was this small, tiny segment, I think it was 2 or 3 scenes, something like that, of Ernest and Molly. And it was the most bizarre, twisted love story I'd ever come across. Here's this man in court giving testimony, admitting to being a part of, killing off his wife's entire bloodline, and he's got children with her and he loves her, and it gave me an emotional reaction. I asked Marty, he said the same. And we were kind of thinking about that for a while. We had another reading, and at which point I actually remember my mom saying something to me, which had nothing to do with anything other than her wanting me to not work so much. It's like, you work too hard. You should just play that Ernest character. I'm like, things started to click for me, and I spoke to Marty about it, and I was like, well, here we have this character named Tom White that comes into the Osage territory and saves the Native Americans. And he's dressed up in a white suit with a white hat. Something bothered me about that. It bothered Marty as well, and we actually realized that the emotional core of the story was in that household, between this white man and these sort of vermin that came to Oklahoma, post-Oklahoma land rush, and preyed upon these Osage women. And this complex, bizarre love story was something that I was like, we were talking about how the hell we were gonna pull this off. And we started to watch Montgomery Clift films. And I rewatched A Place in the Sun on the plane. I was like, oh my God, here's this amazing 40s drama. And one of them, here's the corruption of the American dream, Montgomery Clift during this horrific acts. And then we saw The Heiress with Olivia de Havilland, which was our model for the Molly and Ernest relationship. And then we saw Red River, which was our model for the Hale and Montgomery Clift and Ernest relationship. So we drew upon these great films from the 40s and 50s, and then we basically, Marty went and did The Irishman, and we threw the whole screenplay out, and we told the studio, this is what we're doing. They said, we're not sure we're interested in doing that. And Marty, of course, said, well, too bad, that's what we're doing. And then Apple came aboard, and they said, we'd absolutely love to tell this story. And we're very, what can I say other than we're very proud, because that got us more into the story of the Osage, and we were able to tell it more from their history and their perspective. And when Marty flew out there, they had their own interpretation of what really happened, which was Molly really being the heroine of this story, her pushing the FBI and paying the FBI, getting on a train to meet the president to beg for them to investigate these horrific murders. So we believe it was the right approach.
Amazing. And can we give a shout out to Lily Gladstone? Rodrigo, you were on board. You saw an early draft of that script too, but my gosh, your cinematography in this is so incredible in terms of the coloring, and talk about how you lit the Osage world and Molly's world versus William and Ernest's world, and that contrast, and where there's a switch after the house explosion.
Yeah. So indeed, I started prepping that previous version of the script, and this was pre-COVID, and we went to Oklahoma, and it was a lot. Of course, the focus was, the FBI story. Hoover was even in it, and so it was a whole different thing. But back then, I started thinking, how do we represent the descendants of the Europeans, the white folk, and their view of the world. And so continuing is something that we started in The Irishman, which was representing with the colors of still photography, the different eras. And in this case, I thought maybe we can use photography as a color representation. So I started looking into what the beginnings of color photography, and we found autochrome, which was invented by the Lumiere brothers at the turn of the century. And it felt appropriate that people's memories of their times have to do with photography or cinema or TV or whatever, but back then, of course, photography. And autochrome is a European import to America. So in a way, it felt like seeing Ernest's journey and Hale and white folk through this autochrome look felt like appropriate, because also we're seeing the representation of, say, in the black and white newsreel footage. There are all these different ways of storytelling that also at the end we see, right, with the radio show. So we tell stories, and I thought, let's use photography, which is a way of telling stories. But then when the script changed and the focus became much more about Ernest and Molly, I realized we really have to also represent in a different way the Osage world. And so I started, trying to learn as much as possible. That was a big part of our process, was just research and trying to start to understand the worldview. And one of the things that became apparent is that nature is obviously such an important part of their culture. The position of the sun, all these things are crucial. So it felt that the color for Molly and her rituals, praying, or all that has to do just with the Osage, we decided just to go with a very natural color. So that was just the way that the film negative responds to color, so which is very close to the human eye. So that's the difference between those two parts. But then, so I came with these ideas to Marty. We saw books and, and actual autochromes and all these things. And he said, yes, but how do we evolve this? Where does it go? So then what we did is found a point in the script where things get bad, for everybody. And so now instead of separating the Osage worldview from the, descendants of the Europeans, we gave everybody from the point of the explosion of Bill and Rita's house. All hell's breaking loose for everybody. So from then on, we changed the look to ENR, which is a very contrasty, sort of desaturated look. So it's harsher. So the whole look of the film changes into this harsh, sort of even ugly look. And the lights also much more contrasty. On Ernest, I started incorporating overexposure. When he's being interrogated, it's uncomfortable. And also in the courthouse, he has the sun on his face. So I try to put us all, in sort of in his feeling, uncomfortable feeling. Just as with Molly, we have many points of view of hers, and we centered her in frame. So it becomes much more subjective, the movie, at a certain point. But talking about color, just a quick thing, I found something that's important is that since you're changing the color with these, they're called lookup tables, right? So we're emulating autochrome. So what we do is we take, say, blue. How does blue look in autochrome? It looks a little violet because of the process. How does red look? It looks a little orange, things like that. So we created a software where we actually were able to control each color very precisely. And that's the way we created it. But then the costumes, for example, they change, right? The way they look visually and the way they look on the screen. So that was the whole process that we had to go through, to make sure that, and Marty was another thing. He said, I don't want suddenly, all these beautiful costumes and the colors to be lost because of this autochrome idea, so, but anyway, so that was a whole process. It was very enjoyable and well, that's the result.
Completely unique. So it was a whole, a whole wonderful process finding out about these people that we know nothing about, because of course we didn't learn about the Osage in school for obvious reasons. And though I had studied so many plains tribes, these unique people just fascinated me. So by the time I got to Oklahoma, I had about 2,000 pictures that I then had my crew put on boards, and they were like 10 feet tall and 3 feet wide, and it was everything: townspeople, the different levels of modern dress as opposed to traditional dress, the sisters, totally traditional, modern combined with traditional, and then totally modern, like the Sister Anna. And so it was a lot of research. And I looked at old movies and found some movies that I absolutely love, like the Henry King, The Winning of Barbara Worth, with Gary Cooper and Ronald Colman, and that was big influence on my looks for Leo and for Bob. But the other thing was, just the uniqueness, the wedding coats. No other tribe wears wedding coats. And I was also captivated by the fact that the Osage were rich enough to afford to make home movies, which probably only the Osage and the British royal family could afford. It was $1,800 a minute. But they totally documented their lives, their travel, their airplanes that they could afford to buy and fly, road trips to Colorado Springs, to New York, to shop for clothes, to go to Paris, to shop for couture. And it was all documented. It was a matter of me just doing screen grabs. And then I got Pendleton involved, because the blanket on the Osage is kind of it was the mink coat, it was an incredible status symbol, but also very, very Native American. And I got Pendleton involved early on. They probably made 1,000 blankets for this movie, but I took a panoramic shot of the Osage headed for Washington, D.C. because of the Reign of Terror. And there were probably 100 people in the photograph, and maybe 100 blankets. And I broke it up into 22 screen grabs and blew them up and sent them all to Pendleton, and they perfectly reproduced all those blankets from the 1920s. So I had a lot of good collaborators on this film. And this guy who wears it well.
Everything. She has such incredible wisdom, and she's been telling Native American stories her whole life. She's almost a historian in a lot of ways. She could teach a college course. But besides that, as soon as we got on Zoom with her, and I've said this many times before, we hung up and Marty immediately said, we're hiring her right now. And I said, really? Okay. It's the first time we met. She was amazing. But he's like, I'm sure you want to think about it. He goes, that's the person. Because he knew that there was something about her that embodied the soul of Molly. And she talked a lot about her grandmother and what she must have felt like during that time. And Marty's talked about this before, but about shape-shifting. She came onto set and kind of represented Molly in the way that, was indescribable. And it was like we were talking to Molly. And she changed the entire course of the narrative in a lot of ways. I mean, so many little details that people don't even realize she wove into the story. I mean, the whole idea of a coyote, which fascinates me too. She's like, she talked a lot about how coyotes, and she's from the Blackfeet tribe, that is the eternal trickster that comes in and is greedy and messes with situations, takes things and causes chaos. And she immediately identified me as a coyote. And this became a running theme which was beyond just part of the narrative, it kind of embodied this idea that we had this very fascinating codependent relationship, but we were also very aware that there were certain things that we were taking advantage of each other about. She knew that there was this influx of people coming in and white men wanting to marry Native American women. She also knew that she didn't have the ability to obtain her own wealth unless she had a partner who was white, so she didn't have to answer to the authorities that would give her her own money. I mean, but one of the most fascinating scenes as soon as I saw the movie was the ability of all those women together. I thought it was one of the most brilliant scenes in the movie where they start to gossip with one another and they identify each of the men as different animals. Well, my husband's like a jackrabbit. Well, he just wants money. Well, I know he wants money, but he's settled. He's there's something about him that is different. It was this wisdom and knowledge that they kind of understood that there was a certain nefarious thing going on. Of course, not to the extreme that it ended up being at, but all that was woven in by Lily, and she came onto set and also embraced the fact that Molly was the hero of this movie. It wasn't the FBI that comes in. I mean, there's an FBI story. There's a movie called FBI Story by Jimmy Stewart, which is a horrible depiction of. It's the only other time in cinema history where this story has been depicted in movies, and it's basically a propaganda tool for the FBI. 3 or 4 different stories about how great the FBI is, how they cracked this case, and Jimmy Stewart comes into town and they depict the Osage tribal. Look, they didn't know what to do with their money. They're driving it around in these cars, and they have these mansions, and then they have this earnest character in there in Hale, and they're sort of these very sort of squeamish, very unlikable characters, which of course they are. But there was never this idea of Molly becoming this female heroine, which we realized when we spoke to the Osage, and that was our job, was to listen, was no, it was her incentive. She was the one that paid the FBI to come. It took them years to actually get there and solve this crime. They didn't want to do it. They didn't want to come down there. And she was the one that propelled all of this into action. And then there was a bunch of other amazing stuff that we got to do when we drove out to different ranches and met with people that were direct descendants of the Reign of Terror. I got to meet, the direct descendant of a woman who was actually the niece of my character. And we got to sort of embody what this relationship was like and really hear from most people that this was a love story. There was a real connection between these two characters. As horrible as it may seem and as twisted as it may seem, they did have a love for one another. And, at the end of the movie, essentially, you come to realize that, obviously it was all a lie, but, it was based in a certain truth.
Yeah. I mean, speaking about the end of the movie, when she asked him what was in,
amongst the Osage community, it was such a horrific point in time that still affects the generations there today. I mean, you could still go there today and, not only see the emotions in the Osage people, but how land has still been occupied. And there is still discrepancies as to what happened during that time. Without getting into great detail, the book has also been banned in a lot of ways from many schools, which is pretty horrific when you think about it. What was fascinating for us, and we knew we took a great deal of responsibility. We were kind of honored to tell this story, and Marty's approach was so at the heart of wanting to get at the truth and pay respect to the Osage and hear them out. It was actually this almost transcendental experience because we were there 100 years to the year filming this story. And it was also the same year as the Tulsa massacre. So we were there, I was in Tulsa, and there were news cameras around. It was 1 century later, And it was a century later from the first murder of the Osage Reign of Terror. And the Flower Moon came out, and we were filming on the days when Anna's first murder happened. So I don't know. All I know is we felt this great responsibility to tell this story correctly. And after I worked on quite a few films with Marty, and he had a certain look in his eye and a certain reverence and quietness. And there were moments. He doesn't talk a lot about his process, but when he looked at me and said, "Leo, quietly, I feel this story in my bones. I have to tell it. I have to tell it the right way. I feel it in my bones." The man stayed in his house for 8 months and just studied every day, worked on the scenes. And I remember even in our last sequence with Hale's character, myself, we worked on that last scene, I think, for 5 straight weekends, the whole weekend, because how do you, besides the complex Molly relationship, which was also its own sort of forensic investigation, because we had lots of information, but there were certain times where we realized, okay, what happened during that year? Obviously my character didn't admit to poisoning his wife in reality. And I read all the transcripts and I read all the testimony. And what happened during that year? That year, she disappeared. She was under his care. And miraculously, as soon as the FBI came and took her out of the house, she was no longer sick and dying.
Yeah.
And she sprung back to health. And then that's when the investigation kicked into full gear and people started going to prison. So that was like the only segment where we started to do, had to do some artistic license. But, as the rumor mill goes in the community, of course he was doing horrific things to her like that. And there were specific people that even talked about what elements he was poisoning her with. I forgot my train of thought, but that's that. Ultimately, we just knew that we had to tell the story correctly. And so we all just did as much research as we possibly could.
Incredible, amazing. And